Thank you. I'm going to, this was about a 2.5-hour presentation that I whittled down to the half an hour that we've budgeted here. And so I'm going to rush through things, but from what I understand, we have some time because there's an empty session after this. So if you're burning with questions, please ask as we go through here. It makes it more interesting if you ask as we go along. Do you need microphones for if anybody asks questions? Is that the way it works?
We have students, yeah. So
okay.
Because this is being streamed, not only
right.
People in the audience, you have thousands around the globe.
Hi, everybody. Anyway, you guys have microphones. So if you have a question, why don't you wait until one of these people show up, and then everybody can hear you. Right? I mean, with the microphone. Yes. Okay. Let's try this one. Okay. So I'm going to start. I'm going to go right through this. So what is an EIDD? Okay. Or it's a NENA conformant XML-based data exchange format. So it stands for the Emergency Incident Data Document, which is XML speak for, and it's not actually a document, it's actually a format, an XML format. Everybody know what NENA is? Do I need to explain all that stuff, or can we just keep going through? Okay. Please, ask away. So it contains detailed information about emergency incidents, calls to 911, observed incidents, etc. It also, in addition to just about the incidents, we modified it to support a number of other technologies such as automatic aid and mutual aid for fire and emergency medical systems. And by adding the status and location information about responding units, it enabled us to essentially see where a bunch of resources are so that they can be also dispatched. And it's organized into a bunch of what we call data groups, and each data group has all sorts of data elements in it. And it uses tables and registries to enable interoperable data exchanges. So the whole point here is to make this vendor neutral a standard, and so everything in it is global in nature. So why was it developed? Those of you that know about Next Generation 911 know that it's the standard for it is called I3, and it's ESINet is the mechanism that's used to exchange information. Essentially, all those systems that are under NG911, one of the things that's unique about them is they all use IP or Internet Protocol to communicate with each other. Now, I3, the standard, defines how media, voice, streaming media, video, etc., is exchanged between 911 applications and the reporting parties. So if you make a phone call and it's to 911, the way it gets there and how it gets there is all defined by I3. However, there was no standard format for exchanging data, not call information, but data. And so the EIDD was essentially developed to support interoperable data exchanges. And what kind of data exchanges does it support? First, it supports all the next generation functional elements. Those of you that may not be that familiar with next generation, instead of systems, we call them functional elements. And we took things like the customer premise, CPE, what does the E stand for? Equipment, yes. And we broke it up to its component parts, and we took the CAD system and we broke it up into its component parts, And each one of those things is called a functional element. And so all those functional elements use EIDD to exchange emergency incident information between themselves. So that happens inside of a PSAP or an agency, and also outside of between PSAPs, between agencies. They can all use EIDD. When I was in Columbus last week, we put our heads together, and we actually cannot think of any kind of exchanges or we couldn't think of any kinds of exchanges that would be supported, that would not be supported by the EIDD when two agencies or two PSAPs exchange emergency incident information. There's telephone and radios, but other than that, if you're going to send information from one PSAP to a different PSAP, you use the EIDD. In the doing of this, we also found out that it's useful for all sorts of other things. So not only is it NG911 centric, it's useful for sending information from the traditional CAD systems to records management systems, from CAD systems or computer-aided dispatch systems to emergency operations centers or EOCs, and also to the feds if we want to know information about a particular incident. And it has other applications. For example, if you want to send information to a tow truck company to tell them where to come and pick up the car that was just involved in an accident or was confiscated, it could be sent to them in an interoperable exchange format through an EIDD. Ambulance companies, if they need to respond to an accident or a situation, and the same with the news media. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. So what's inside of a EIDD? And these are, before I talked about data groups or data components, each one of these bullets represents a data component. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but in great detail. We can if you have questions. But at any rate, these, I'll go through them fast. So common incident information, what we used to in the old days call the header for an emergency incident. What kind of an incident is it? What's its priority? Any kind of notes that a call taker or dispatcher makes or remarks about an incident, it carries that. Then the dispatch information. Who was dispatched, when they were dispatched, who did the dispatch, and who was dispatched. Also the agents and agencies responsible. So which fire department was dispatched and which agent or telecommunicator in a PSAP actually did the assignment. And then, of course, it has the call information. In the last session that I was able to make yesterday, I noticed a discussion about why are we calling them calls. The reason we're calling them calls, there are Facebook calls, there are SMS calls, there are regular telephone calls, there's video streaming calls. We decided to call them calls in NG911 because we didn't come up with not want to come up with a different name for each one of those things. So we're still referring to all of them as calls, but they're not just telephone calls. But in this case, in the EIDD, we have room for the telephone number that made the call ID, which is a unique ID that it's associated with that telephone call, the cell towers, the caller's location, all that kind of stuff that comes with the telephone call or the message or the Facebook post or the Snapchat, whatever it is you're using. There's an ID associated with it. That all comes with it.
Is there a wild card for the ones that will be embedded next year?
Well, that's the beauty of it. It's just a call. I mean, the ones that come in the future, whatever they are, they will. But it's the same basic information about a call that we carry.
ID would be whatever the format.
Right. In order for it to work, I actually should have mentioned this. Let me go back if I can figure out how to do this. The first bullet, you see a tracking ID in the parentheses, there's a type, a priority, and then a tracking ID. That's actually known as an incident tracking ID. It is globally unique across the whole universe. It is a unique ID that's assigned to that incident by the first functional element that handles it. Typically, it's the call handling or the border control function within the ESINet, but that is globally unique and follows that incident wherever it goes. The same thing happens to a call. It's assigned two things, an incident tracking ID and a call ID. So if it's a text message, it's still assigned an ID. If it's a telephone call, it's assigned an ID. So any future technology, one of the requirements, if they want to work with 911 directly, they want to come into the PSAP, they have to have a unique ID. Was that kind of your question? Okay. Did you want to?
Yeah, I guess under the same topic, so I think you just answered it for most of the functional elements, right? They can't rewrite that call ID. Because I know if you get into enterprise solutions, a lot of elements rewrite their own call ID, and it's hard to correlate.
That's a great question, because the way that technology works today, they already have an ID, right? That's where you're getting at. So I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but basically we have room in the EIDD for both. We have for the local ID and for the global ID. So we got room for involved people and vehicles within it. You can define them. And also responder information. Who responded to the incident, who came back, what their statuses are, their location, all that information. The disposition of the incident when it's finally closed, and we have room for multiple dispositions. And this is we decided not to carry streaming media within the EIDD, okay? We just carry a URL or a URI that defines where you can get that streaming media with it, and that's primarily for the size of it. And then we also decided to support the standard, CAAA, Consolidated Central Alarm Association, or something like that. Anyway, they have a standard for alarms directly interfacing into a PSAP, and we decided to support their standard. And there's a way within the EIDD to do a couple of other things. For example, if these two if a single incident as you went through it and started working on it became two incidents. You thought there were one incident when they came in, but there were in fact two incidents. There's a way to split them. And if you had a way, if you thought that these were in fact two incidents, but in fact they were the same incident, then we have a way to merge them. We also have a way to define relationships between incidents. So this is in like the situation in Mississippi where the bridge collapsed, and then each car going, so that's the big incident, the parent incident, but then each car going into the river was a separate incident, and so it was a child. So we have a parent-child. The same thing can work in earthquakes or large fires. You can have several buildings burn, etc. This is kind of what it looks like. It's an eye chart, and I'm not going to get into it, but very much. Just most of these are optional. The one on the very top is not. It's an EIDD header, and it has to have that incident tracking ID so we can track that incident. The whole point of this thing is that you can have multiple, like dispatch information on your left, or incident information. So each call could be its own set of its own data component, and each fire department that was dispatched could be its own data component. So you can have multiple things with the occurrences of this. Notes, you can have multiple notes. Yes, sir.
I'm just kind of wondering whether everything is cast in stone forever, or whether you have a mechanism for changing things.
That's a good question. I'm
okay.
sorry.
Now I have another question related. you have a lot of optional elements here, and not every incident would have all the options filled in.
Correct.
So how do you know for a particular incident, you're looking at this clump of data, whether it's a complete clump of data? Whether you have all the optional elements that were created for that document.
I need to pay you to show up to these. I'm going to talk about that in a second, okay? So if you could just hang on for a sec. What was your first question again? How does it change? Okay.
Yeah, what's the mechanism for,
Right.
for
So,
modifying?
I will get into the status of where it is, but this is an ANSI standard, American National Standard Institute, and they have a change mechanism. So the standard, by definition, has to be re-examined at least every 4 years. This was put forth by a joint effort between APCO and NENA. There's a group of dedicated individuals that have been working on this for, in my case, about 9 years, but some others almost over 10 years. So we've gone through all this thing, and we realize that there'll be changes. And so the ANSI process will allow those changes to happen. So some information about what is not inside of an EIDD. And this gets a little bit to your question. It does not carry any historical information. So for example, if an incident started out as a smoke in the backyard, and then by the time they got there, it was a fully engulfed structure fire, the fact that it started out as smoke, that was when it was reported. But if you looked at it now, if you looked at the information that was contained in the EIDD, it wouldn't have that information unless it was a note or something like that. It's the current status of that incident. If you want to know the history of that incident, then you have to go in a logger. The logging recorder records all these things, and I'll talk about that in a second. As I said before, it doesn't contain streaming media. And it may not be a complete self-contained state of an incident. So this is basically, we're going to answer your question. So the first time that you get an EIDD, you get what you know about it, okay, what that agency knows about it. But even if you think about it, we've got a fire agency and a law enforcement agency responding to a single incident. However, those incidents, their view of each agency's view of that incident may not contain the other agency's information. So if you want to know everything about an incident, you have to ask every agency involved, what do you know about this? And that's the last bullet on here, the second to last. You have to request, tell me everything about this EIDD that you know about right now. So if you use that incident tracking ID, you can find all the agencies that are involved in it, and then you can request a composite view from each one of those agencies, and then you know you've got the full picture.
So I have a question.
Sure.
So the EIDD then is kind of the transaction. It's just a momentary, here's what's happening right now. It's like an update? And then there's going to be a log of all these things. So if I wanted to see the whole history, I'd look at some parsed version of that?
Right. We haven't dictated how this works, okay? It's a format. But we've allowed it to just, like the last bullet says, only change information. So if everything is the same about an incident, except that the priority changed, okay? It was a code priority 1, and now it's priority 2. The only thing you have to send about that is just to change priority.
Okay. Okay, so somebody else is keeping state, so to speak, and all I'm doing is saying this is transactional. Here's what's
Right.
happening, here's what's happening. Are these in the body of a SIP message? How are these sent?
That's really good. That's the last slide, okay? And we'll get into that
All right.
in a second. No, it's okay. But yes, it's in the body of a SIP message. That's one way of sending it. Here are some rules about exchanging EIDDs. So they must be logged. And again, I don't know what the audience's knowledge is of next generation 911, so I'll assume you don't know everything. But if you do, just hit me and I'll skip through this. Because it's IP again, all the functional systems can use the same logger. So all the systems can log in the same place. In fact, you can have a logger on the ESINet, and several agencies can use it. But the point here is that every time you send an EIDD, it's logged, along with some other stuff, like who created it and when it was sent. But the contents are logged. And when you receive an EIDD, you log what you got. So then we can track stuff. And this is an important one because there's a lot of confidential or sensitive information within EIDDs. If you think about it, there's medical information, there's stuff in there that we don't want necessarily the general public to know. So users need to be authenticated before they can be sent an EIDD, and then the EIDD needs to be filtered based on their role. And obviously the transport must be secure. This is another rule. So if you look, I don't know if the color, green area, that's a vendor A's system. And red, the functional elements in red are a vendor B's system. If they're sending information between the two systems, the two vendor system, they have to use an EIDD to do that. However, internally, within their specific systems, they do not. Whatever they want to do, they can do themselves. They can decide how to exchange it. We didn't get into the mechanics of how they do it in their proprietary systems. So when you're sending information from one agency to another, so let's say it was a call that came to PSAP-A, and PSAP-A started going through the call, and then realized in the middle of the call that in fact it belongs to PSAP-B. But it processed that a bit, and now it wants to send the information that it got over to PSAP-B so it can continue doing what it needs to do. Well, when it does that, it uses its language to process and classify that call. So the original PSAP for an accident with injuries may have called it an ACWI, but the receiving PSAP for the same type of incident, their nomenclature for it is 226. And structure fire is the same way. So how will the agency that got it, the PSAP-B, know what to do with the information that it just got? So that's a problem that we attacked, and what we decided to do is to use registries and tables to solve that problem. So as I mentioned before, we have a bunch of registries within the EIDD standard, and they define global incident types. So what happens in PSAP-A, if they're going to send an EIDD over to PSAP-B, the first thing they need to do is convert their local incident types to the global incident types. And then when it arrives at PSAP-B, they take the global incident types and convert it to their local types, so then they can apply their policies to it. And we've done that for a number of data elements. So there are registries for incident codes and types, for incident statuses, for disposition codes, for emergency resource types. We standardize all the, Engine 101, what is it? And unit statuses. Those are all standard. And for all those values that I just mentioned, not only does the EIDD carry the value, the common or the registry, the global value, it also carries the local value, so that if you're working just within a local system, then you can use the local one without having to do any translations. And then we have other data elements in there that have local equivalents. Incident tracking ID. We also, like you were saying, we also have the local incident ID that was created by the local system. Common incident priority, we also have the local incident priority. Unit and resources IDs must be globally unique, but we also carry the local ID. So how do we make things global? This is kind of across the board in NG. We basically, like in Portland, where I used to work before I retired. Maybe I'm working now. Anyway, they have Portland Police has a police card, and its ID is 1603. So how do we make that globally unique? We append the unique identifier globally for the Portland Police Department, which is police.portland.oregon.us. The globally unique agent IDs, same way. This is the local PSAP that dispatches units within the Portland area. So John G. Jones becomes John G. Jones at boac.psap.oregon.us. Same thing with position IDs. Now, priority levels are a little bit different. So we defined priority levels from 0 to 10, with 10 being the highest priority. And so what you need to do on your side, in your system, is you need to find the equivalent priorities. So your code blue may be a global 10. And then our hope is that all these conversions and translations take place behind the scenes. We don't want the dispatcher or call taker struggling, oh, I'm going to send this over to this other PSAP, so what do I need to do to change this stuff? So there's a table behind the scenes. Those of you that are vendors here, I don't know if any of you are, but at any rate, you need to do that. You need to not force the operator, the user, to make those kind of decisions. So where are we? The EIDD is an American national standard. It's gone through the ANSI public review process. As I mentioned before, it was put together, if you will, by a joint NENA and APCO working committees. All comments that were received during the public review were adjudicated, and it will soon be published by APCO and be available as American national standard. Now, right now, it's too bad Carol had to go, because right now what we're doing is we've got two working groups within NENA. They're also joint NENA-APCO, but they're based within NENA. And one working group is working on the transport or conveyance of EIDD from one place to another. And the second working group is working on how to manage these things. So you notice there are tables and policies that need to be created. And the management work group is working through those. And they'll put together a best practices document on that. There are two EIDD testing events that are being planned for the EIDDs. One is the NENA I-7, and that's actually scheduled here at IIT in the spring of 2017. And APCO is doing an IGIS Springboard initiative, and that's in the planning stages. I think this is my last slide. How are we doing on time? Am I out? Oh, we got a couple of minutes. Okay. This is the initial standard that we put together in the conveyance working group, and it's under development right now. So we've defined 3 ways to essentially exchange EIDDs from one system to another. Push, which is via SIP. So this is you are in a PSAP in New Jersey, and all of a sudden you get an EIDD that you were not expecting. You never expected to get it. It just shows up unsolicited. You don't know what to do with it. Well, it's accompanied by an OASIS EDXL RM message, and this is primarily used to get resources. So if an agency, like a large brush fire or forest fire, it needs more engines or more support, it sends out a request, and the EIDD defines the incident, but the message defines the request, and then there's transactions, messages that go back and forth that essentially commit the resource eventually if you're offering one. So that's one way. And then and that will occur periodically. I mean, that's not the main way. We believe that 90+% of the time, an FE will subscribe with another one or more FEs for EIDDs. So in a PSAP, you will have the call handling where the calls are received, and the dispatch will subscribe for all calls from that call handling. So every time an EIDD, a call is received, there's an EIDD generated, and because this dispatch has subscribed to it, it gets it. And then once it gets it, it needs to subscribe to that incident, and then it'll get all the updates to it. Okay, you guys see how that works? So if you have like a high priority incident, all they typically need is just a location and a type, and then they send it to dispatch, and they're still working on the call. They can enter additional information. So that first EIDD goes across to the dispatch. They start getting resources to the scene. In the meantime, they're getting all the updates so they can see all the comments that are coming in and so forth. And then eventually when incidents, when units are dispatched, that call taker gets that information back because it's functional FE subscribed to all the EIDDs for that incident, so it knows which units are responding to the incident. I'm almost done.
I just wanted to say, I've got a presentation next door, so I can't finish, but I would encourage everybody to come over there, and they're going to have a big piece about the database, so I would love for you to.
Okay.
I'm sorry I didn't say it again.
No, that's cool. Now, how do we control the information that's contained in an EIDD to make sure that it's not sensitive or confidential information doesn't get where it's not supposed to go? So we've devised a way to piggyback on top of the I3 or the NG911 authentication standard, if you will. So if I'm going to subscribe, let's say that I'm going to show up at your door, and I'm going to knock, and I'm going to say, I want to subscribe to all these incidents. Well, when I do that, I present you my credentials. You look at my credentials, and you decide that I'm not allowed to see certain information. And then you filter that information based on that. And when I show up and present my credentials to you, I'm presenting two things. I'm presenting my role, and I'm presenting my agency. Those are the two important things. There's other stuff in there like who am I and so forth. When I present those to you, there's a policy store that says this role within the local PSAP, there's a policy for this role and inside and outside the PSAP. And it looks, and me as the FE that's going to send you the EIDD, I look at that policy store, and that policy for you, for that role and that PSAP tells me what information I can send to you. So that's how we're going to do it. Now, just a few nits about the subscribe, notify, support. When you subscribe, you can establish how often you want to get EIDDs. You can say, I want to get them every 2 minutes, or you subscribe a minimum, a maximum. I don't want to get it any more than 1 a minute. And you also say a maximum, and you say, typically I want to get one every 5 minutes, like an update. The receiving FE can say, nah, I don't want to support that. So try again. Once they establish the rate, the sending FE cannot send it any more frequent than the maximum rate that the FE that subscribed said. Okay, so that's how you kind of do that. You can specify a location. So I only want to get EIDDs within this geographic area. Or I don't want to get any status updates for any engine that moved less than 100 feet. Because if you got AVL on something, they can send it every second, even though they haven't moved at all. And then you can have content filters. And it can get as fancy as, I want to know every time an incident has this person, and you define the person, involved in it. And anytime that happens, Homeland Security gets notified. Or it could be, I want to know these kinds, only fire incidents am I interested in. So if there's a type of fire, then send me this EIDD. Now, everything that I skipped through it. There's one that uses HTTP GET, and that's the agency puts the EIDD on a web server someplace and sends the agency that wants it the URI or URL for that, for where that EIDD is located, and then they use HTTP GET to get it or dereference it. As you might imagine, those of you that are involved in this, there are a lot of vendors that don't know anything about SIP. We supposedly have a contribution in our working group coming that will support web services for this kind of subscribe, notify, etc. The reason we went with SIP is it gives us a lot of the requirements embedded within it. There's already standards that define exactly how this stuff works. It's a lot more work to do it in web services, and somebody needs to step up and do it. I think that's all I got, yeah. So if you guys got any questions, go for it.
I'm kind of thinking several different questions, but the most important one is this global incident ID. And I'm wondering what's the mechanism for ensuring that it's a global ID? I can imagine that somebody sitting at 911 gets a call, and they say, well, there's a fire in the building next door. And at the same time, or more or less simultaneously, somebody out on the street has pulled a call box or firebox reporting the fire in that way. So presumably you could have two first incident creations of a global ID. And I'm wondering whether or not there's any mechanism for merging these later, and if it's too much later, the people who have already grabbed that incident ID and have it put on a little piece of paper or stored or somehow, if that global ID gets changed later on, then they're going to lose the thread.
Potentially. Okay, so let me address the first thing. What's the mechanism for making it globally unique? It's a GUID, which basically stands for Globally Unique ID. But there's mechanisms within software for doing that with a 99.999% certainty that nobody else is going to come up with the same ID. It's not, like 1, 2, 3. It's got like I think it's a 32 character thing, and it uses all sorts of funny stuff. So a computer understands it, but a human being's not going to be real excited about trying to find it. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, there is a mechanism for merging two incidents that appeared after a while to be the same incident. Now remember, each time, and the way you merge two incidents is you actually send out an EIDD saying this incident tracking ID has been merged into this incident tracking ID. That's logged. So you need to go to the logger, and you're searching for the old one. You find the old one, and then you should, that it was merged with this new one, and then if you want to follow the whole thing, then you actually need to search for both. So that's the kind of stuff we need, I mean, like in the real, when we put this stuff together, we went through all these use cases. We didn't think of everything, and that's why I think it was, somebody asked, I think it was you, what's the process for changing it in the future? I'm sure we left something out, and we're going to have to fix it. But for now, that one we got covered, I think. Go ahead.
Okay, the global ID thing, you might use a blockchain kind of thing.
A what?
A blockchain.
I'm
You
not
know,
sure.
Bitcoin
Oh,
uses
yeah, okay.
uses blockchain as a fundamental technology. And with a Bitcoin, you want to make sure that you have the only Bitcoin in the universe.
Right.
So it's an internet kind of a thing.
This is I don't know if it's exactly the same. This is I'm on thin ice. I have to tell you, that's not my area of expertise. But the EIDD uses, or the specifications in I3 for how it's done uses something similar to that.
Okay. Interesting.
We done? Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.